Welcome to Called to Lead, a podcast series on pastoral leadership for today's church, presented by the Markey Center in Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministries. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo. Join us and explore leadership in the Catholic Church through stories and conversations with pastors, ministers, and scholars. We connect theology with real-world ministry, highlighting how today's leaders answer God's call to build just and inclusive communities. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Called to Lead. I'm your host, Dr. John Rinaldo, and I'm so excited to be joined here today by Dr. Paul Schutz. Did I say that right? Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. How are you, Paul?
Doing great. It's great to be with you today, John. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
I love it. Well, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. I'm really excited about the conversation today because not only do you have a recent book that you just released, but also you've done a lot of research and writing and talking on clericalism and flourishing. And so I'm looking forward to spending some time delving into that. But before we do that, Paul, to begin, can you share a little bit about your own journey? What brought you into theology and the church's life of the mind and ministry? Like, how did you get into this world?
Yeah, I always tell people, the first thing I say when I answer this question is it's a long story. So I'll try to keep it brief, but it is kind of a long story. I grew up Catholic. I was very much involved through my family in the life of the church from a very young age. Both of my parents, were deeply involved in our parish and the work that the parish was doing. My dad was a business person, so he was doing the finance and administration side. My mom sang, she was in the choir, she's been a lector her whole life, those things. And I went to Catholic school, so there was a kind of immersion that went with that. But I started getting really active in music first and foremost, and started out playing piano, singing a bit, and music ministry became my sort of first point of contact. So in our home parish, I was in the choir, but then I would, play the piano for masses at the church and at the school, either like a little, interlude post communion kind of thing, or later on, like actually accompanying the liturgy. And as time went on, I got more into singing. I remember, in seventh and eighth grade, maybe in high school, when I started to play percussion more, played trumpet, I did all this kind of stuff. But my dad and I would actually like go to my high school and borrow giant, chimes and cymbals and bells and things to like spice up the Christmas liturgies and Easter liturgies. And I worked really closely with Tony Buccilli, the choir director at my parish growing up, and my mom was singing. So music was really a big point of contact. But I was also an altar server and lector, and I've always been into reading and thinking and all that stuff. So it started really young for me, and developed. And in high school, this continued both involvement, and then I founded a liturgical music ensemble at my high school that got going because we needed better music at our liturgies, as we've all had this experience,
Yes.
right? And so I founded this ensemble. It kind of continued to exist, maybe does in a totally different form now, but that was back in the late 90s, and went on to college. And I always say that the college years are kind of a really interesting time because toward the end of my years in high school, I started to ask a lot more critical questions of the church, and in particular on questions of like gender, women's role in the church, the inclusion of LGBTQ plus people. Started asking questions about the relationship between theology and science, or religion and science, because I was a very scientifically minded, still am, person and a theologian and somebody that's deeply invested in and committed to the church. So I started to ask these critical questions that at the time I didn't really know were theological questions, but they were. And I grew up in Southern Indiana, so like the theology I was encountering was of a certain flavor in the 1990s and things like that. But I had really great teachers in my high school too, and we would talk about this stuff. But I came to college at Boston College where I did my undergraduate work, and it was there that I was sort of like, I need to take a break from this Catholic thing for a minute. And I did, and it kind of happened naturally. I mean, I kind of, settling into college social life and things like that. I wasn't going to church as much. I would go sometimes, wasn't going as much. I always went when I went home, and I always still helped out when I was back home, like with whatever people needed. But I kind of laid off the gas a little bit on some of this stuff. And in that time, I also, for the first time, encountered Buddhism and Buddhist thinking. And I had a professor in the honors program at BC who was a practicing Buddhist and introduced into our honors seminar some Buddhist, writings. And I explored those and I was fascinated by it, and actually kind of got a little into the practice and study of Buddhism for about a year and a half or so. And various things happened after that. September 11th was one of them in the midst of this, et cetera, et cetera. Fast forward a year and a half or so into my sophomore year in college, I was sitting alone, and it's really interesting because I always think of the liturgy as really has always been central to me. I was sitting alone on campus, pretty much alone during Easter break, because I was from Indiana. Boston is far away. My parents were like, I don't know if we can really pay to fly you home for 3 days, that kind of thing. So it was Holy Thursday, and I'm sitting in my dorm room. All my roommates are gone. Campus is a ghost town. I'm like, what do I do? And I was like, well, what do people do on Holy Thursday? They go to Mass. So I was like, I'm gonna go. So I went to the Holy Thursday liturgy at St. Ignatius Church on the campus of Boston College. It's run by the Jesuits, but it's a parish, huge parish. And witnessed and participated in one of the most beautiful and profound liturgies that I'd ever experienced. And I was like, wow, I was blown away by the music, by the experience, by the way they handled the washing of the feet, all of this stuff. So next day, Good Friday, I was like, oh, I'll go back. So I went, back. And at the Good Friday liturgy, the thing that I'll never forget is that they sang the setting of the Passion of John. It was with the director Michael Burgo, who will in a minute in this story become my mentor. He had his own setting of the St. John Passion, and they had a Puerto Rican blind woman named Michelle Abadia, who's wonderful, brilliant singer, sing the part of Jesus. And something about that moment just embodied, and showed what the significance of the passion is. To have a person with a disabilities in this beautiful voice singing the role. I mean, it's just like it brought together a lot of things that were unexpected and wonderful and beautiful in so many ways. And that just like floored me. Then I went back to the Easter Vigil. It was amazing. And I walked up to Mike Burgo at the end of the Easter Vigil, and I was like, this Triduum has been a profound experience for me. Could I get involved? And he said, yeah, of course. What do you do? I was like, oh, I play and sing. I've done it my whole life. And he was like, start coming to the Sunday afternoon mass, if you want, or choose one. You can join whatever choir you want. And so I did. And then that was how I came back around and really immersed myself in the church's life and in the musical ministry, liturgical ministry in a new way. And Mike became my voice teacher. He also was something of a mentor in liturgical ministry to me for my junior and rest of my junior and senior years. And that was really how these things happened. And so, that brought me into the work of ministry in a new way. And my senior year, he had me arrange and direct and put together a big, like basically a small orchestra to do the music for Easter Sunday noon mass. And that was just like the capstone on this whole liturgical experience. So I was doing music and stuff on the side too, of course, but that was really, really critical. And so I took all of that out. I did Teach for America on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation after college. I founded a tiny 2 or 3 people music ministry in this parish on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. There were only 30 people at Mass, and we had 3 people singing. And we found a piano in a garage and had it repaired and transported to the church just so we could have something because they had nothing. And that was huge. And then this went on. And then the big moment, I think, in all of this, if that's not enough already, but the big moment is that after Teach for America, I was looking for a job. I was looking for like a gap year, what I thought was a gap year job. And I saw that there was a position, director of worship, music and liturgy at this church called St. Mary Catholic Church in my hometown, Evansville, Indiana. And I was like, oh, I could apply to that. That'll be a good 1 year, 2 year filler, kind of thing. And I went and I interviewed. I had to audition with the choir. I grew up in this town. I did not know this place existed, but it had one of the most vibrant musical and liturgical lives that I've ever seen and that I ever will see. And by the time I finished, 5 years almost there, 4.5 years there, I came to this realization that what I had witnessed there in that parish's liturgical life was so profoundly transformative that I probably would never see it again. I had never seen it before, and I would never see it again. And I think that's actually proved true in a sad way, because I think I would love for the more of the church to have this transcendent, compelling vibrancy that I saw there. And that's actually what led me to theology. It was witnessing these people and being one of them. I was a member of the community as much as I was a staff member, worshiping together, through that worship, being called to justice, being called to service, being called to all manner of reaching out to the poor, reaching out to the church, finding, discerning what God is calling us all to. Those 4.5 years ended up being the crux of my own discernment process. And so one day after this 9:30, mass we had, I was talking to our pastor, Steve Linsnick, and good friend of mine, and he's now retired. And we were talking, and I said, Steve, I think it's time for me to go. I thought I was going to be here 1 or 2 years. I've been here 4.5. It's ready. It's time for grad school. He was like, well, what are you thinking about? I said, well, music, maybe composition, English, maybe English literature. That was my undergraduate degree, like getting back into literary criticism and stuff. And he was like, have you ever thought about theology? I think you might make a good theologian. And I was like, no, I've never thought about it. So I went home and started Googling theology programs and what it did. And something clicked, in that moment. And I applied to 3 programs for a master's degree in theology and 4 programs for a master's degree in composition. And I got into my top choice, Fordham, with funding, which, was great for the master's. And I got into my last choice for music, only my last choice. I was rejected by the other schools with no support at all. And I was like, this decision has been made for me. Thank you, Holy
Yep.
Spirit, and so I went off to grad school. And so that all personal ministerial formation leads to, I think, the 7 years I spent at Fordham. There, I continued. I was an assistant director of campus ministry for music and liturgy. So I did that, continue to do that work for 7 more years at Fordham, unexpectedly. That's a different story. And then was doing my studies, and that's really where the intellectual sort of dimension, you framed it as, church's mind, thinking with and for the church. That's really where that was formed. Tons of work in ecumenical dialogue, Greek Orthodox and Catholic historical theology. I'm really kind of passionate about that. That doesn't come up often at Santa Clara. But theology and science, ecological theology, which is where I kind of ultimately landed in the network of those things, and that's the primary work that I do with the undergraduates at SCU. And all of that is inflected through the same commitment to justice that I've always held, that led me to do Teach for America, that was, honed and sharpened at St. Mary with the outreach work that they were doing, and all of that. And that brings in critical feminist perspectives, liberation theology, a real commitment to the poor and marginalized, like through the work of theology, serving those communities. And of course, through my own work with my mentor, Elizabeth Johnson, herself, one of the most prominent feminist theologians of the 20th, 21st centuries. All of that came together, and then I ended up at Santa Clara, again, kind of luckily, and have been here almost a decade now. So
That's crazy.
that's kind of how I go about it. And I'm always listening to the world, listening to the realities, and we know we're living through really difficult times right now, and asking, what does the gospel have to say to this moment, to this time, to this place, and
What's
all of
beautiful
that.
about that journey is I think so much of it is natural and normal, right? When you talked about the
Yeah,
questions that you were asking as a high schooler in college and kind of
yeah,
not drifting away per se, but taking a break. And then the role of liturgy,
yeah,
as
huge.
momentous, and then the mentors, right? I think you shared about
Yeah,
3 different mentors that came alongside of you
yeah.
that encouraged you, that helped shape where you're at today. So that's a beautiful thing. Well, all that leads to, your most recent book that you just wrote, The Theology of Flourishing, The Fullness of Life and All Creation. Tell us a little bit about that book, because that was just released right in 2025, correct?
Yeah, just about what, 8 months ago now,
Okay.
something like that. It came out. Yeah, I think that theme, and I'll just say a couple words about this. Like that theme of flourishing is kind of the undercurrent, in everything that I experienced. My own journey of discernment was a journey toward me discovering who I am and who God is calling me to be in service of the church and the world and the communities that I'm a part of. And I name that flourishing, this sort of coming in, discovering and entering into the fullness of whoever it is that we have been created to be. And that this is this expansive concept that actually kind of shows us God's principal intentions, not just for humans, but for all of creation, that every creature, every ecosystem, the world as a whole, societies and ecosystems together, I call them socio-ecosystems, right, are meant to flourish, are meant to enter into the fullness of what they can be as God intends, as God calls them, and that it is the duty of a Christian to discern what that will looks like, to discern what it means to flourish and what it means to foster the flourishing of others. Again, others very broadly, ecologically and socially. And then to enter into that. And it really all revolves, this argument all revolves around John 10:10, Jesus saying, the thief comes only to kill and steal and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. If that's Christ's sort of stated mission statement, in John, then we're all participants in that mission, the mission of abundant life. And so flourishing, though, is not just this simple positive concept. I want to be really clear because, like, when we start with flourishing, we recognize all of the ways that the world isn't flourishing. So it actually casts greater light when we start by saying God intends the fullness of life for all creation. We can see the realities of injustice and social degradation and death and theft, right? Those words that Jesus uses. We can see all those realities much more clearly. And through that attentiveness to those concerns, discern what it means to be a Christian in the here and now, a follower of Jesus with that mission of fostering the fullness of life and entering into our own fullness. So the book takes that idea and plays it out theoretically. It traces that theme through Christian history, through the early Christian period, the medieval period, 20th century up to today, and then proposes a theological framework for thinking about flourishing and actualizing it in discernment, through that careful attention to our relationship with God and the world, individually and collectively, toward what I call in the end a practice of amor mundi, or love of the world, that I see as also the love of God, because God has given us this world and intends for it to flourish. So, in loving the world into that fullness, denouncing injustice, hate, harm, violence, and announcing this message of life and wholeness, right? We are participating in that mission that Christ articulates. So that's the quick and dirty, description of the book.
I love it. Well, we need people to read that book for sure. But in terms of flourishing, one of the things that's very interesting to watch, and you've been in ministry for a long time, I've been in ministry for a long
Yeah.
time, is those who are called to lead in ministerial
Mhm.
settings aren't always set up to flourish. Right. And we could talk all about burnout and
There's a million
unrealistic
different ways. Yeah.
expectations, and things like that. But let's get into this idea of clericalism. Pope Francis certainly kind of put a spotlight on clericalism, I
Mhm.
think, for the church in many ways. And we often say it's beyond just individual attitudes, right, or just individual people. That there's a structure or a culture that's happening here. So you've written about this as a structural phenomenon in the church, right? What
Mhm.
does that distinction mean, and why is it important? And ultimately, what can be done about it?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, first I want from the very beginning to shout out my co-researcher, co-author, Julie Hanlon Rubio, who's up at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, that also belongs to Santa Clara. But Julie and I co-designed and carried out and wrote this study, and it was a real privilege to work with Julie. So I want to make sure from the start that everybody knows that this was the work of a partnership, and that she's a magnificent scholar and was a great partner, and it's wonderful for this work to continue to bear fruit. So, thinking about that distinction, right? We titled our study "Beyond Bad Apples." Because, and we drew that term kind of from like the Black Lives Matter movement and some of that people talking about like bad apple cops or bad apple this or bad apple that. A lot of times, the narrative of clericalism in the church, even in the writings of Pope Francis and other ecclesial leaders, has been individualistic or individualized in a way that we talk about, this priest, father this, or deacon this, or bishop this, right? And that there are bad apple clerics in the church, bad apple clerics, meaning individuals who just act badly. And they might be clericalist, right? They may sort of lord their power over other people or suppress the agency of lay people or sort of rule by, diktat. But it's a few bad ones, right? It's just that. And so that's been often the narrative is that this is about individuals acting badly, men behaving badly, so to speak, because clergy are men, in the church. So like that kind of thing. What we started to see, though, through our study and what the shift that we wanted to make was to understand this as a structural phenomenon. Now, understanding things as structural phenomena is really kind of complicated, and I won't get too much into the nitty-gritty of the like theory here, but the idea of a structure is that, or a structural phenomenon, a structure is something that shapes the whole context. It's like the invisible background theory for like how a society operates or how a church operates. So it's like you don't see it. It's not about the individual behaviors. It's like the matrix, it's like the stuff, the code of the whole thing that's
There's a
kind of
90s reference
there's a
for
90s reference, right? It's like that code that's running behind a website or something like that.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to kind of think about clericalism and ask, is there a way in which we could understand structural clericalism as this kind of background theory or this code in the church? And we asked some questions, we did a study, and what we found is that there's kind of ample evidence for thinking of it in that way. And what that means for the church is basically this, that because of the way that the church historically has afforded honor and power and authority and prestige to people who are ordained, right? Just by virtue of their ordination. Doesn't matter who they are, what their, educational background is or economic background. Like by being a priest, let's say, one carries a certain amount of power, authority, honor, that kind of thing. And such that when somebody with like a Roman collar walks into a room, the vibe changes, as we would say in California, right? Like you could have a gathering of 60 lay people in a parish hall chatting and blah blah blah, and then the pastor walks in and everybody's attention sort of shifts to the fact that he's in the room. It might not shift to him. They might not go over and talk to the pastor, but something happens, right? And I think when I say this, people can usually imagine what I'm talking about. Like everybody's attention kind of shifts because he's in the room. The authority figure is in the room. That's what we mean when we're talking about structural, right? Clericalism. That it is something that's like baked into the life of the church, that clergy often are sort of set, as we say, above and apart from lay people and others in the church, and given this authority and status, which, on the one hand is deserved, like we're not denying that. And this is, again, not about individual priests, but that when that status, which is always present, even if a priest doesn't want it, it's there,
Mhm.
right? He
Yeah.
can be the most what we call anti-clericalist or resistant, to clericalism priest in the world, but that doesn't change the fact that when he walks into the room, the dynamic changes because he's wearing a collar or everybody knows that father's in the room, right? So it's that invisible code, that sort of invisible deference that happens that can be more easily exploited than other forms of power. And in our study, we link it to sexual abuse and the reality of sexual abuse in the church. But broadly speaking, what it means is that people are sort of formed in ways that sometimes they don't even understand to defer to the authority of a priest. And that if, unless a priest is, or an ordained person is actively working against that tendency for everybody to sort of just listen and do, unless they're actively working against it, they're actually reinforcing this sort of cycle. And so again, it's kind of in the background,
Hmm.
and it can be easily exploited. And again, the other thing that I would emphasize is that it's there even if a priest doesn't want it to be there. It's
Right.
still there,
What
and it affects laity,
Well, and I
as
think
well.
what's interesting too is also it's not. I mean, sometimes we go to like seminary formation and how that
Yeah,
may or may not affect certain things, but the reality is it's the parishioners, it's the lay people of the
yeah,
community that bestow that authority, right?
absolutely.
And it's part of our church structure there as well. So,
The
you know,
culture, right? The
there's
whole
a
culture of the
culture,
church.
yeah.
Yeah,
So certainly, we certainly see it in specific cultures. When I think about Asian Pacific Islander cultures, I think about
sure.
Filipinos and the whole mano thing,
Yeah, yeah,
and that it's a sign of respect, which again, you've already said, our clergy certainly deserve, but it can be taken to
yeah,
extremes. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so yeah, I'm a lay person working in the church listening to this podcast, or I'm a priest listening to this
yeah,
podcast. What do we need to do? What
yeah.
structures, what conversations need to happen that allow us to shift beyond this mentality of clericalism that is often, as you said, unspoken?
Yeah, or not even realized. And I think there's the answer to the
Mhm.
question, right? So in all of the work that people do on the way structures work, whether those are structures of oppression like poverty, racism, those things, or structures like clericalism in the church, the first and most important thing is to raise awareness about it, to bring it to people's consciousness. And that means that it has to be brought to the consciousness of priests, and I'll say something about that in a minute, or clerics. And it also has to be brought to the attention, brought to the consciousness of lay people. Because, like you said, John, and that's exactly right, everyone, if we understand clericalism as a structural phenomenon, it means that everyone participates in it. And they either participate by enabling it, right, by resisting it, or they participate in it by trying to transform it, in some way. But the thing about structures is that they operate by sort of disguising themselves as the status quo, right? So we treat it as the
Mhm.
status quo. This is just the way things are in the church, right? But the reality is that the church doesn't have to be clericalist. It is clerical, right? We're not talking about, eliminating the priesthood or
Right.
any of that. Like, that's not the conversation here. The point is that how priestly authority is constructed, how it is understood, how it functions, most importantly, what it does in the life of the church, how priestly ministry is constructed does not have to be in a clericalist manner. Priestly
Mhm.
authority does not have to be clericalist, but the status quo is that it is. That's kind of what we found. And so, because of that, the first thing we have to do is bring it to people's consciousness, bring it to people's attention. Like what we found in our study is every time that I've had this conversation and I say to a priest, when you walk into a room, the dynamic changes even if you don't want to. Even if you formally say, reject clericalism, and you say, I am not clericalist, I do not use my power against other people, people will defer to you unless you invite, and that's the second step, unless you invite their fuller participation.
Mhm.
So for a priest, first of all, it's becoming conscious of the ways that that power is operating, even when they're unaware of it. And then if they're truly committed to exercising their priestly ministry in a way that does not participate or resists or transforms this clerical status quo, they, because of the assumption of authority that they possess, they have to invite, input. So it could be like this. Here's the classic example we found in our study, and I love talking about this one is homilies. Okay, so there are a lot of times, we all know this, that we hear a homily and maybe it's not that great, or maybe it's even offensive, or maybe it's frustrating, or whatever it is. This happens, right? So often, though, lay people do not feel comfortable talking to a priest or deacon about how a homily affected them,
I would
or
never do that, and
never,
I'm pretty
right?
outspoken.
Yeah, and you're like, that you know this world, you live in this world, right? But to go up to your priest after mass and
Yeah.
say, Father, that homily really hurt me, and my husband experienced this or something, and I just need you to know like what, and it's coming, even that's coming from a really authentic place of suffering, a really authentic place of vulnerability. People don't do that, or they don't come up and say that story did not work. Like
Yeah.
I understand that you want to warm the audience up with a joke, but like preach the gospel. Like nobody's ever gonna say that, to their
Totally.
pastor or deacon or something like that, right? But that's part of it. Why don't they feel comfortable? Why don't they feel, right? Is it because they assume the expertise of the priest? Is it because they assume some manner of holiness or commitment to the text or, formation, whatever it is? But the important thing there is a restriction on freedom. There's a restriction on agency where a person feels like they can't go and say this thing that they might be holding very deeply. They might want to leave. They might be so frustrated or sad that they want to cry in the moment, but they can't express that because of the way this structural clericalism is operating because they feel like they can't talk to their priest that
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
right? On the flip side, the priest may think, and I'll give you something to back this up in a second, may think, I am so open to feedback. I want to hear from my people. This is, I really think our parish would be great if people would just talk to me, but nobody ever does, right?
Yes.
And that's his inner monologue. That's the priest's inner monologue. Nobody ever comes to me with their feedback about the homilies, but I'm super open to it, you know? Well, why aren't they coming to you? Because you are the priest. And unless you have broken down that wall of clericalism, of structural clericalism, and said, hey, parish, we are a community. I am partners with you in this work of the gospel, preaching it, receiving it. If you hear a homily, you hear something's going on in your heart, and you think I should know about it in response to something I've preached or whatever it is, I want you to come to me and talk about that.
Well,
I
see,
want you
this
to,
is this is the
that kind of thing.
distinction. Yeah, this is the
Yeah.
distinction, right? Because this is where I think oftentimes we start blaming priests,
Yeah.
but it's not really about the individual priest behavior that caused, this divide. It's the structure that we've grown up with. And so what I don't want clergy to hear if they're listening to this is like it's your fault because it's actually not.
No. And that's
But
actually
there
what I'm saying,
but there's
right? Yeah.
behavioral changes that we could do to kind of break that open. I want to
Exactly.
really reemphasize that because that is what I think we need to hear, right?
Yeah, and that is what, and I want to be really clear too, that is what I'm saying,
Yeah.
right? This is not a matter of individual responsibility. That priest's inner monologue is very open, is really, really wants to be inclusive, wants to be hospitable, right? Wants to be really loving of the community. But many priests don't realize that lay people just don't feel like they can have those conversations. And so that wall has to be actively broken down. And this is the important detail by the person who holds the authority.
Hmm.
That's the only part that's on the priest. The part that's on the priest is that the priest has to initiate it because he holds the authority,
Yes.
right? But once that conversation, once that space is open up, have a focus group, have office hours. I don't know what it is, right? Let people come up and talk to you after mass. Something will change.
Hmm.
And the important thing there is that in this conversation about clericalism, and this is what Pope Francis called for as well, what we see in the very idea of priestly authority or priestly leadership is a shift from the priest as the sort of top-down manager that can kind of like impose, and canonically he can do this, so I don't want to dismiss that, but right, he can do that. But the third model that we propose, three models of priestly authority, the third model we propose in this study is a model rooted in empowerment, listening to the spirit and then asking the spirit to instruct the leader on what it means to bring, and this is where flourishing comes in, bring that community into the fullness of what it can be, bring that community in the fullness of what it is called to be by God. And that model of empowerment is really about giving power away.
Hmm.
So in the same way that a priest might ask for feedback on a homily, if there's a capital project going on in the parish, they might say, hey, I know we got a bunch of construction managers and experts in this parish, or we've got a bunch of experts in finance here. Say to the community outright, I don't know much about that. I was not trained to manage finances, right? But there are people out there who are.
Yeah.
So come to me, talk to me. I want to form a committee. I want to do whatever. I want to work with you all as the members of this
Mhm.
community to make this community the best thing it can be. And there's a giving away of that assumption of power there that opens up new horizons for the life of the community. And I think that's the model that we're kind of striving for. And I actually think that's the model that a lot of priests are striving for, a
Mhm.
lot of leaders are striving for. But structural clericalism, again, because it's this invisible background, it just leads to all of these, it shuts things down without anybody being aware of it, even if they don't want to, you know.
Mhm.
And I got to share just real quick one statistic here from our study. We, on this point, just to kind of bring all this together, asked this question of priests. I am open and deacons. I am open to feedback on my homilies or my preaching or my leadership style, those three things, you know, preaching and leadership. I guess I said three, but it's two. Okay, homilies and leadership from my parishioners. About 85% of recipients or respondents, sorry, about 85% of respondents said yes to that. We did find a difference in people who were formed in Jesuit contexts and people who were formed in seminary, like diocesan seminary context. Diocesan seminary context a little less open, but they still were like 75, 80%, right? Then we asked lay people, my priest or deacon or whoever is open to feedback about their preaching and leadership style. And the number of percent of people that said yes was
Eight.
8%. 8. 8%,
Wow.
92% no, 8% yes. So this is what illustrates, right? This problem is that there's a gap in perception. There's a gap in understanding between how people see themselves and how parishioners or others see them. And that is exactly the kind of outcome that structural clericalism
Yeah.
produces. So again, if that priest is not actively working to give away, to empower, to lead the community to flourish by letting the spirit in and actively dismantling that, the status quo is just going to continue, and the status quo is going to be clericalist.
That's incredible, and I think it's rooted obviously in Ignatian discernment, right? You
Absolutely.
talked about discernment, which is really a beautiful thing, and really it aligns well with kind of just good leadership theory. I always love what John Maxwell talks about in terms of the five levels of leadership, and
Yeah,
he said the lowest level of leadership is positional leadership or role power. People
right.
follow because they have to. The church is inherently kind of there. That's the structure. And most leaders, regardless of what field you're in, that's kind of where you start. The
Yeah.
challenge is to move up those levels of leadership, right? It's the second level of leadership being relational based, permission based. People
Mm.
follow because they want to. And that's what we're looking to build. We're not looking to get to level five right now. We're looking to help church leaders move from one to two.
Yeah.
And the amount of effectiveness in terms of what we're trying to do in the culture of evangelization in our parishes increases and multiplies dramatically if we could just do that. And that's, in essence, what we're
Huge.
talking about here, which is a
Yeah.
really beautiful
And
thing.
I mean, you know, to go back to my own experience, like St. Mary was the first place that I ever saw someone leading a parish, Steve Linsnick, who knew how to do that, right? Who
Hmm.
knew how, and we probably were like level 4 or 5. I mean, you know, but it was a unique place. But the reason why people were so engaged. I mean, this was a place where we have this video from a Pentecost liturgy that we made as a teaching model for liturgical life, you know, in the diocese that I was in. Um, and one of the things that always strikes people is that you can notice the number of people who aren't singing more easily than the number of people who are.
Mm.
And that's very rare. We all know this, very rare in a Catholic. I mean, you look and it's people are like really singing, and then there's like a few people that aren't, and they stand out like a sore thumb because of that. So, but I mean, this took years and years of empowering and building up, you know, leading people to discover their gifts, to discern, and then to serve. And this wasn't a Jesuit context. I think we were just, you know, gifted with a particular kind of thing. So that's an example I would give is I saw it there, and that's actually what brought me into this work was wanting to see that in more places in
Yeah.
the church.
Dude, we can keep talking about this forever. I need to have you
Yes.
come back at some point because we're definitely over time per se. But
Fruit. Oh, okay.
I
Yeah.
absolutely love this. One last question for you, Paul.
Sure.
What gives you hope when you think about leadership in the church today?
Yeah. Oh, lots of things. I mean, I think that, I don't want to sound like, hopeless or anything. What gives me hope? I mean, I think that what we've seen from Pope Francis and Pope Leo so far is indicative of a certain way of proceeding that is open to listening, that is open to, synodality has been a huge buzzword in that regard. And that idea, that very idea of a church that listens at the highest level is really the first step toward transforming us from a more clericalist kind of church to a more empowering, flourishing church. And so I find a lot of hope in that.
Mhm.
And I think that if that can kind of make its way through the church and inspire lay people and clergy to enter into their sort of full participation in a new way, then we're going to be heading in a great, great direction.
I love it. Well, thank you for sharing that, Paul. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Again, Dr. Paul Schutz is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. Again, thank you so much. We're going to have you back for sure. So stay tuned.
Be happy
We'll get a
to.
chance to hear from Paul a little bit more in the future. That wraps up another episode of Called to Lead, presented by the Markey Center for Leadership and Ministry at Santa Clara University's graduate program in pastoral ministry. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to follow on your favorite podcast app to make sure you don't miss any episodes of Called to Lead. And we look forward to seeing you at the next episode. God bless you all.